The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets about what matters most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I think, we come back to prudence. A lot of that has to do with asking, what is it that I'm called to do, and where do I have an area of influence? And I think a lot of that has to do with knowing oneself to the degree that you're able to shore up the place where you're particularly vulnerable.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Russell Moore is editor-in-chief of Christianity Today and former president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. His new book is Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. He invites unmoored and discouraged Christians to step into an uncertain future, letting go of the kind of culture-warring, politicized Christianity that has led us to this moment of reckoning. In Losing Our Religion, Dr. Moore shows how we might steer clear of both cynicism and complicity in order to imagine a different, hopeful vision for the church. Russell Moore, I'm so happy to have you back on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. And I love this podcast. And I also love the Habit newsletter, which is one of those that I read every time it shows up in the inbox immediately.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to know it. I'm glad it has been good to you. So you got a book coming out about the same time that this podcast is going to come out. Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. We've got a lot to talk about, more than we're going to be able to cover in this time we have together. But I'm really interested in this idea of how you tell the truth courageously in what is becoming a post-truth culture. So I guess that's kind of where I want to start and camp out for a while.
Yeah. One of the things that people say to me a lot, and it really almost doesn't matter what the specific topic is, whether they're talking about some of the abuses that we see of power or any number of other things, is to say, I thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who are in situations where they're thinking, this doesn't seem right, but I seem to be the only one who knows that something's gone wrong. And that's what worries me, because I think that can easily lead to a cynicism that hurts both people and institutions.
Yeah. How would you define the term cynicism?
I think that with what I mean by cynicism really can go in two directions. It either can go to a loss of expectations of things being better that lead people just to give up and to walk away from an institution, a friendship, a family, whatever. Or it can be a loss of expectations that says things are never going to be better, so I just need to play the game the way that it is.
Yeah.
And I've seen a lot of people who kind of lost themselves. Maybe they're in a workplace where they start to just think, well, everybody is just really in it to knife everybody else. And that means if I'm going to survive, I just have to do that. And so they kind of numb their consciences and end up becoming a hack. You know, we think of a hack in political terms, but you can be a hack in anything, in just about anything that you do. Once you start to separate kind of what you know internally to be right from what you see as realistic. And that's what really worries me, is a lot of times the way that people are kind of losing a sense of their moral grounding isn't so much because they change their views on things. It's because they start to say, get real. I mean, come on. This is the way the world is. We got to act this way.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, the virtue of prudence, you know, we think of as sort of being pragmatic or being somehow conforming to the way the world works, as you said. And, but there's I think real prudence means you are conforming to big R reality, before you start figuring out what methods and techniques are going to work in the real world. But yeah, cynicism. I think one of the things that's troubling about cynicism is as people who don't have a lot of practice being cynical get cynical, they're easily manipulated by people who are really good at being cynical. Right?
Yes.
There's a lot of amateur cynics running around.
Yes. Yeah, because I think that there's a self-protective mechanism that causes a kind of numbness, and that can be easily exploited. And there's also, I think, for most normal people, there's less confidence than there is with people who really want to exploit. And so while they're checking, okay, wait a minute, this seems to be this way, but it can't be because the people who are telling me something else are very confident in what they're saying. And so those people end up kind of spinning their wheels in a way that can lead them to lose themselves really quickly. Yeah.
Let's talk about persuasion, right? I mean, I think one of the things I got from your book is the extent to which people can be manipulated without being persuaded, or if it comes to somebody who what's the language I'm looking for here? That actually I got from your book, the idea that I guess you can be demoralized and therefore conform to foolishness without being persuaded that the foolishness is true.
Yeah. A friend of mine who's actually, he's an atheist, disagrees with me on a lot of things religiously, but he's a really brilliant man, Jonathan Rauch, writes about the way that there's a strategy at work, both in troll culture and cancel culture, that the object is not to persuade someone. It's not to really even mobilize people. It's to demoralize people, which is ultimately just to exhaust you. And I see this happening a lot. Sometimes I will have the same conversation from a pastor who's dealing with a congregation and a member of Congress who's going to town halls in his or her district. And it's the same sort of dynamic at work, where you have people who start to just self-censor because they're so worn down.
Right.
So I knew of a pastor who had a family of flat earth moon landing deniers who came to church. And, we all have been in churches or other institutions where they're people that we love them. They're quirky. We know that. We kind of build that in. But he found himself sort of checking himself before he would say things like, let's support our missionaries around the globe.
Yeah.
Because he just didn't want to deal with the email. So it wasn't that he was worried about losing an argument over what shape the earth is. And it's not that he thought these people were going to influence other people in the congregation. It was that he just said, okay, I just don't want to have to deal with that. And I see that showing up a lot where you just start to shift in such a way that you can have a very small group of people who actually control the ecosystem of an institution, because they're the ones who kind of set the parameters of what's talked about and what's not talked about. And I think that's what we see. I mean, there are studies that show this is what is happening on social media. Most people on social media actually aren't angry, fearful, radical ideologues of one sort or the other, but those people get quiet. Yeah, kind of the people who are reasonable and rational, they've got more to lose because they actually want to maintain their relationships and their friendships, and so they get quiet, and then it starts to look like, oh, everybody is just crazed and angry. And then that actually, it becomes self-fulfilling, because once that starts to become normal, then you get more of it.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we do about this? Right. That this is a podcast. A lot of writers, I hope, listen to this podcast. I know I get quiet. I've got better things to do than wrestle around in the mud with pigs who like the mud.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely self-censor, because I just don't have the energy to argue with people.
Yeah, well, I mean, we come back to prudence. A lot of that has to do with asking, what is it that I'm called to do, and where do I have an area of influence? And I think a lot of that has to do with knowing oneself to the degree that you're able to shore up the place where you're particularly vulnerable. And so if you're the kind of person whose tendency is toward quarrelsomeness and argumentativeness and so forth, then you really need to err on the other side and sort of check yourself more. But if you're the kind of person who thinks, I need to, because what everybody's able to tell themselves is, I need to sort of conserve my influence.
Right.
And there will be a moment when I'm going to be called on to speak, but now's not the time. So you can watch this and you can see it in a church, on a school board, in any sort of institution. You'll have people who will say, well, I can't do anything about this because I don't have the platform and the influence to do that. So they stay quiet. Then they get the platform and the influence, and they say, well, I can't say anything about this because if I do, then I'm going to lose this and I'll be replaced by somebody worse. And so it just becomes, you look back at a lot of white pastors, for instance, in the Jim Crow South, and there were a lot of them. Martin Luther King actually directs a lot of his letter from Birmingham jail to this very tendency. A lot of them who knew better, but who said to themselves, this isn't ideal and this isn't moral, but I can't get out in front of my people. And we've got just too much at stake right now. And so they just held that in such a way that they actually weren't able to speak to the community that was coming later, because they think that they're being patient, But what they're actually doing is accommodating to the people who have the power at the moment, and they're sacrificing the people who don't have a voice.
Yeah.
And so you have to sort of remind yourself of that and ask yourself whether we can always convince ourselves that something is prudence when in fact it's just cowardice. It's easy to do.
Yeah. You say at one point in your book that at some point you're no longer conserving influence, but hoarding influence.
Yeah. You're at some point you're able to translate your ambition, even if it's just ambition not to be sort of kicked out of the what C.S. Lewis would call that inner ring. That ambition that's there, you're able to translate that into other things so that you don't ever even know it. So it's kind of like what George Orwell said about if you're beaten, you have to do math equations, and you're beaten every time that you come up with an even number. Then you're going to have your mind is just going to start finding a way to come up with odd numbers without your even recognizing that that's there. And I see that happening with a lot of people when they're trying to decide what's right in my situation and where is my conscience speaking. You can really silence that really easily.
Yeah. It's painful to get kicked out of a tribe.
It is. Yeah, it is. And it's painful not just in terms of what you think about it. It's painful at the limbic level.
Yeah.
So there's a sense of the evolutionary biologists would say that it's because for most of human history, getting kicked out of the tribe meant starvation and attack by predators. I would say that a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're designed to be spiritual beings. And so we hear when we're being kicked out of some tribe, "Depart from me, you worker of iniquity. I never knew you."
Yeah.
Even if cognitively we know that's not what it is, it feels that way. And there's a sense of panic that can come with that.
You, seems to me, consciously chose to let yourself get kicked out of a tribe. How did I don't know how interested you are in talking about the details of that. Like, how did you do that calculation where you said, you know what, I guess I'm willing to get kicked out?
I don't know that I made a conscious calculation. I really believed what my tribe taught me. I joke that I'm a Southern Baptist in the Federal Witness Relocation Program because I still think of myself as a Southern Baptist, even though I'm a member of a non-denominational church now, because that was my entire life and teaching. And there was a sense people who are kind of outside of Southern Baptist life don't really understand the sense of not a superiority, but almost a kind of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that you're taught, there are other Christians, bless their hearts, they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
But we're Southern Baptists. And so you have that mindset, but I didn't change in believing what it is that they had taught me. Yeah. And so when that started to be in conflict, I actually didn't get kicked out of any tribe because most of the people, I could go every year, the Southern Baptist Convention meeting, and I would walk away affirmed, encouraged, elated. There would be somebody would make a vote to defund the entity that I led, and it would fail 99% to 1, literally. And my board was great. But what I realized was that I could spend a great deal of my time sort of fighting these battles, and I could win, but I didn't like what it would take for me, how it would change me to be able to win that. And I had sort of seen that that mentality in a lot of people that I knew who kind of started out with a sense of conviction, theological orthodoxy. They saw some real problems that were there that they wanted to correct, who moved into this fighting mode and were never able to leave it. It started to become what may have started as conviction that led to fighting became a desire for fighting that substituted for conviction. And I could see how that could happen. And I had seen that happen to me before. I mean, when early in my ministry, when I was a doctoral student, I was very headstrong, theologically conservative, which I still am. But I was sent to do some reporting and analysis as a early 20 something kid, to a more liberal splinter group from our denomination. And I really did not like what that did to me, because I was reporting back on some, things that were happening at that General Assembly. And I found myself with this sense of, aha, I gotcha. Yeah. And so I was having, all of the conservatives on my side high-fiving me. And I was sort of taking delight internally in some of this. And I thought, wow, this is a first step to something that's not who I want to be.
You understood that as a 20-something?
Yeah. I think that's largely because of the sorts of people that had been an influence on me from a distance, largely earlier as a teenager. C.S. Lewis and Frederick Buechner and people like that, where there was even if there's not, it wasn't as though I was looking back to sets of arguments that they had taught me, but there was a feel that in them I recognized resonating with the Gospels, and this didn't feel that way. It felt like something very different. And so there was kind of a check. And what I would notice is that I would be able to rationalize that. And I would be able to say, well, I don't really like what this is doing to me. And I'm kind of serving with some people that seem to be really angry and fearful and not Christ-like, but it's because the stakes are so high.
Yeah.
And so we need to, because the stakes are so high, we need to act this way. But I mean, people just had taught me the Bible too well that I could just hear what that actually was.
Yeah. No, that what you just said is so important that we say, well, in this case, the stakes are so high that these things that Jesus said about turning the other cheek, or about, all the things Jesus said, those, I've got an excuse not to, I don't just have an excuse, I have a responsibility to not do, and then I turn to the fact that Jesus turned over some tables one time.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, there was, I mentioned this in the book, that years ago when reading Jayber Crow, when it first came out, Wendell Berry has this time where Jayber's cutting the hair of Troy, and Troy starts talking about the communists, and we need to line them up into camps or something like that. And he asks Jayber what he thinks, and Jayber says, "Love your enemies, turn the other cheek." And the response is, "Where did you get that sort of communist propaganda?" And I remember thinking at the time when I read that, well, that's a little on the nose.
Yeah.
I mean, people wouldn't do that. And now I'm in a situation where I hear all the time from pastors who will have that exact situation where they just kind of parenthetically mention, turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
And afterwards, someone will say, why are you giving those liberal talking points or something like that?
Yeah.
And the pastor will say, well, I'm quoting Jesus Christ. And what's interesting to me is that the response that comes back is not, oh, I didn't realize that. I need to spend more time in Bible study. The response is usually, yeah, but that's fine for normal times, but that's not good for hostile times. And you look at this and you say, first century Roman Empire is as hostile as one can get. Crucifying enemies of Rome is pretty daggum hostile.
Yeah.
But there's that sense of, and to go back to Wendell Berry, he mentioned in another context that desperate times call for desperate measures is the most dangerous sentence that we can adopt, because you can always say that the normal kinds of moral norms and kindnesses and manners, even all those are out the door because I have to do this right now, or else everything is gone. And that's a dangerous place to be.
For one thing, it suggests that somehow it depends on me, the Christendom or whatever depends on me and not on, say, Christ.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at, you mentioned the turning over of tables. That's really one of the most remarkable things about going through the Gospels, is that you have a couple of moments. Jesus drives out the money changers. Jesus curses a fig tree, and that's about it. When it comes to every other moment, Jesus is the most tranquil person in the room.
Yeah.
And if you look at what's happening with the temple, for instance, you have Jesus taking seriously what's happening on the inside to the witness of God's presence and place and how that is affecting people. He's completely unperturbed by these so-called threats on the outside.
Yeah.
And we tend to do it completely reversed. So whatever our particular tribe is, well, we have all kinds of reasons why. Well, the things that we do, we just sort of bear with those patiently. And whatever is happening on the outside, we cast as in completely darkness versus light terms.
Yeah.
And that's just completely reversed from.
Yeah. I think it was in your book, and forgive me I think you can comment on this, whether it was from your book or not, but the language of spiritual warfare and the idea that we don't struggle against flesh and blood, but against the principalities and the powers. It's so dangerous to use that language to talk about our opponents who are actual people and not not spiritual entities, or not only spiritual entities.
Yeah, and it's a secularization that is happening to people who think that they're standing against secularization. So it's kind of like the modernists of 100 years ago who would get up and preach an Easter sermon by saying, well, what the resurrection means is that you have a new start and a new chance for your year. Yeah. Which doesn't sort of raise your New Year's resolution to the level of the resurrection. It lowers resurrection to the level of your New Year's resolution. Yeah. And what happens is people take the language of spiritual warfare and they start applying it to their political or their cultural disagreements against other people. And what you end up doing with that is concluding that people are demonic, meaning they're irredeemable. And so once you decide that people are not only not persuadable, but their motives are all completely dark and they're completely irredeemable, then you start to think about, then you start to classify them that way. And you just think about in history, what always happens with dehumanization. It always starts with language. In every case, you start referring to people as rats or parasites or something like that. That's the first stage to some awful kinds of violence. And the same thing really happens when we start talking about spiritual warfare, because once you start classifying people as the devil, and that means I can do anything I need to do to fight the devil. The irony of that is that you become like the devil, who is the accuser. And that it really warps the way that we start to see people. And it also is a really shallow view of the way that people are. I mean, if you think about how many times, I can think of times when I've changed my mind on something. I can't ever think of a time that I've changed my mind at the end of a 20-minute argument where I've been humiliated. Instead, somebody will talk to me about something, and usually I sort of mull on it for a long time. I mean, I can think of times where I've mulled on things for years, and it didn't make sense to me until there was a kind of crisis that happened. Jesus talks about the prodigal son. The famine hits, and he starts to come to himself, to think, I need to find a different way to do this. And even that was in stages. And that's the way that people change their minds. When we don't see that, and we assume somebody who disagrees with me is always going to disagree with me, and the fact that they're arguing with me is showing me that, when a lot of times, I mean, even on things I've changed my mind on, the last stage of it, I was arguing more forcefully for my view than I ever was before, because I was sort of talking to myself and trying to argue myself back. If you don't realize that about people, then you get into this situation. And what ultimately happens with that is, to go back to cynicism. I had a woman who came up to me at my church and said, you know, my daughter's gone off to college and she's having a theological crisis. And I said, okay, well, that happens all the time. And I was expecting her to say she's gotten involved in some, you know, immoral behavior, or she's got a philosophy professor who's, you know, but she said she knows a lot of atheists and agnostics, and they seem to her to have peace, joy, love, gentleness, kindness, self-control, and she doesn't know how to process that. Well, a Christian view of humanity does know how to process that, in terms of people who are made in the image of God. They have consciences and instincts, just like we do, that are often better than our ideas. And she couldn't process that. So you end up with people, once they kind of have a group of people that are characterized as being wholly evil, and then they meet them and they know, wait, they're not. So there must be some other group of people who are wholly evil, and these people must be wholly good. And it starts this whole cycle.
Yeah. I love that idea that there are people whose instincts are better than their ideas. That's really good. You know, the evangelical tradition is a tradition that's committed to the idea that people change. You know, that they don't have to stay the way they are.
Yeah.
And I do appreciate the way your book says, hey, the evangelical tradition gives us the language we need to, to make things better in this culture. And it's not that the evangelical culture requires that we continue to descend into some hellscape.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I was at a meeting one time with a secular researcher in Washington, who came into a group of us and said, we just have done this study, and the results are shocking. And the results are that these evangelical Christians who actually do evangelism, try to witness to people, actually are more caring and sensitive toward refugees, immigrants, prisoners, the poor, and their communities. And they were all just shocked by that. And I said, that doesn't surprise me at all, because that's what I see all over the place. Not with people who say evangelism is important, but I'm talking about the kind of people who actually are going into the prisons and having Bible studies, or having these ministries to homeless people, or who are working with refugee communities in their neighborhoods. That they are the people who are accustomed to being in conversation with people who disagree with them, and who see that as a moment of persuasion, human to human connection, not of coercion and overpowering. And as a matter of fact, they know that coercion and overpowering doesn't work if what your ultimate goal is new birth. And so that just didn't surprise me in the least. And often I will say to people, if you want a better kind of evangelical Christian, and we got a lot of problems with evangelical Christianity, the answer to that is not for them to be less Christian and to tamp that down. The answer is for them to actually be more Christian and therefore more Christ-like. And that's what I think is very difficult for us to see right now.
Yeah. And even, we started early on in this conversation about persuasion. I think there's a long tradition of, there is a long tradition of persuasion in evangelical Christianity and all Christianity, period. But
yeah. And if you look at, for instance, there will occasionally you will have a community that the city council will come in and outlaw a mosque or something. Well, that is the most antithetical thing to actual evangelical Christianity that there can possibly be. Because evangelical Christianity is saying personal transformation and personal conversion doesn't come with external behavior. And you can't legislate people or have them at the end of a sword becoming Christians. The best you can do is to have them become pretend Christians. And so the people who actually get that are the people who are saying, no, you're not going to mistreat our Muslim neighbors. We completely disagree about who Jesus is, but they're made in the image of God. And the way that we have these conversations is with the open proclamation of truth, not with some sort of coercive power. And that coercive power actually, even though the people who are carrying it out would think of themselves as very conservative, is what in every era would have been defined as Christian liberalism. Where Christianity...
Tell me about that. What do you mean by that?
Well, Christianity is a means to an end, and it's about those external structures and habits, but without internal conversion and transformation. So J. Gresham Machen, who was a leader in the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the 1920s, wrote a little book called Christianity and Liberalism, where he said what he defines as theological liberalism is any use of Christianity as a means to some other goal, regardless of what that goal is. So if what Christianity is, and you would hear a lot of this kind of in the very triumphalistic modernists of the early 20th century, what Christianity will do is to undo communism, and it will civilize people, and it will make people more American. Therefore, we need to get Christianity out there. Well, Machen's point, and I think he's right, is that, well, that's not Christianity anymore. Yeah. Does Christianity have implications in terms of the way societies live or the way people's marriages are, or yeah. But if Christianity is just the way that you get to those higher goals, then it's no longer Christianity.
Yeah. At one point in your book, you talk about the importance of checking yourself when you realize that you're believing something because it's useful and not just because you think it's true.
Yeah. Because I think that if you go back to that inner ring idea, an exile idea, there are a lot of things that we're expected to say that we don't internally actually believe. Now, you can eventually talk yourself into that, but you have to say those things, and that gets us. I mean, James and Jesus both talk about let your yes be yes and your no be no, which means the internal and the external have to be in alignment. And if they're not, what you end up with is a literal loss of integrity, of a holding together that starts to break down. And then you lose yourself.
Yeah.
And you end up trying to find some way to compensate for that. And it gets really dark.
Yeah.
And the society gets really dark at that point.
Yeah. I remember one time I was listening to probably the New Yorker podcast, might have been some New York Times podcast, but you were on it. And the person, y'all were reflecting on your sort of leaving the tribe or being at odds with the tribe, and the interviewer said, so wouldn't it work out better if you're in a more liberal situation? He said, but I'm not liberal.
Right.
And I thought that said so much to what you mean here about not believing things because they're useful, right? That happened both to the right of you and to the left of you, right? There are people on either side of saying, hey, it'd be more useful if you would believe this way.
Yeah. And it also is it's sort of a sign of where secularization has happened, and that it's happened across the board, not just with one kind of person, that we tend to think of, well, the things that really matter are the sort of partisan political alignments.
Yeah.
And the other things don't really matter at all. And so if you're somebody who cares about the poor, you need to be in a liberal church, when in reality, well, you might well be somebody who cares about the poor because Jesus told you to, and you think that he was born of a virgin, raised from the dead, and is seated at the right hand of God, and will judge the living and the dead. I mean, that's not liberal. That's something very different. But we don't even have those categories now to be able to think that through. And I had on my podcast a few weeks ago a conversation with Rainn Wilson, who was Dwight on The Office, and he's on kind of a spiritual journey, I think, and really questioning some things. But where he and I disagreed was, he said, I think what's important is faith. And it really doesn't matter if it's Buddhism or Islam or Christianity or whatever. It all is kind of getting to faith, and that's what's important. And his view is that all of these things are kind of lanterns that are carrying the light. And I said, would you consider that it might be kind of trivializing to my Muslim friend for you to say that both of us actually believe the same thing? We just disagree on these minor questions of the Trinity and the Incarnation. My Muslim friend would say, no, that's not an incidental detail to me. That's Allah is not triune and has no son, and that's really important to me. And I think that there's sort of the kind of social atmosphere we're in right now makes that sort of the default, that those things really aren't important. What's really important is whether or not you hold to the same sorts of partisan political views, or even more so, if you hate the right group of people with the right amount of intensity.
Yeah. How did that exchange with Rainn Wilson go? Did he when you suggested maybe he was belittling Muslims?
I think because he seems to me to be a really good faith, for lack of a better word, a good faith. He's sincere.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think he's really considering these sorts of questions, and maybe hadn't ever thought of that in the same way that, a lot of us don't think of things. And it's he comes out of a Baha'i tradition.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
Yeah. And so it makes sense within the way that he sees the world.
Yeah. Okay. Talk to me about, we need to wrap this up, but before you go, I do want to hear you talk a little bit about, I really appreciate what you say about the limbic system, fear, the way that fear causes, I love, you said that the lizard, our lizard brain that's triggered by the limbic system, that reptilian brain is connected with the original reptile, the serpent in the garden. When fear causes us to self-censor or to otherwise not tell the truth as we understand it, can you give me some thoughts on some talking points on how to tell the truth when it's fearful to tell the truth?
I honestly think that this is going to sound like a Sunday school answer, but it's because Sunday school was right in this. And that is, I think that a big part of combating that lizard brain is being narratively engaged with Scripture. And what I mean by that is not that you're able to go to Scripture to find things that speak to some people. They know how to use the Bible to here's a passage when you have anxiety, here's a passage when you have fear, and other people who know how to go to the Bible to say, here's a passage to defend your beliefs on predestination or whatever. And what I mean by that is that you're actually embedded in the storyline of Scripture in a way that you have a counter story to make sense of your life, as opposed to the one that is being constructed for you. And so for a lot of people, I think the answer is not so much that you immediately know, oh, wait, here's the problem here, and here's how I correct it. I think you are 99% of the way there if you just start to notice, wait a minute, I think I'm becoming a fearful and angry person, and it just doesn't fit with the story that I'm in. And even if somebody doesn't know, what do I do at the moment? I honestly think for most of the time, that's not the point. The point is the stepping back and saying, Lord have mercy, I don't know what to do. That's the win.
Yeah. Well, Russell Moore, thank you so much for being here. This has been a great conversation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Hope you as well. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.